Welcome to the Neurodivergent Parenting Podcast. I am Melissa Cox, and I'm here because, like you, I'm trying to make sense of this beautiful mess of neurodivergent family life. Parenting is chaos with brief moments of order. Neurodivergent parenting is chaos on steroids. Each week, we'll sink into real conversations about this journey, not the Pinterest perfect version, but the real one where we can share strategies that actually work for us, feel seen, heard, and build a community where we genuinely understand each other. So, whether you're listening while pacing your kitchen for the 10th time today or finally sitting still after everyone else has gone to bed, you're in the right place. Let's figure this out together, one beautifully chaotic day at a time. Welcome. I have a fantastic guest on today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Adrianne Kmet, and I'm an autistic mom raising autistic kids in British Columbia. And I'm also a nurse, and I've specialized in autism and neurodiversity. And I've worked with families for about 8 years now. And I'm now moving into broader advocacy and professional development.
Awesome. We are excited to have you today. So first, can you tell us, I guess, so I always like to start with a soft question, like
Mm.
what is your favorite special interest?
Oh. Oh my goodness. So right now it is like I've often had like cups and mugs and like drink containers, but right now I've been really into these uh um they're I don't even know what to call them. They're like a developmental toy box delivery subscription service. And I've really been enjoying those for like my kids, but also I'm like, I know a part of this is definitely for me. And I love doing all the research and like seeing how the toys are developed to match development and like all of the resources and everything. So that's kind of been my real
Yeah,
interest lately. Yeah.
I love that. I kind of want to get that information later to make sure that because I work with a homeschool co-op with mostly neurodivergent kids, and that would be amazing. I would love that.
Yeah, yeah, it's really fun. It's been like mainly for my youngest, who's almost 3, but then my middle, who's almost 8, is loving it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the sensory seekers and sensory avoiders. It's always an interesting balance in our house.
Right. Yeah. It's always so interesting when you have multiple neurodivergent family members because you're going to get that. And then it's like one person needs something while the other person is really struggling to cope with it. I often find like, especially around like auditory stimming, that's something that can be a big thing in families because one person really needs to be doing it while the other person's experiencing auditory overload from it.
The echolalia can be
Yes.
overwhelming for my oldest, who is a sensory avoider.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and my two younger kids are sensory seekers.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
That is also one of the things that comes up for me a lot with coaching parents is, yeah, that's like one of the biggest struggles is the balancing often the parents' sensory needs as well,
Oh,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
the child's sensory needs. And then if you have multiple children, balancing their sensory
Yeah.
needs so that they're not just constantly triggering each other's meltdowns.
Yeah. But I also find like it's a really fascinating exploration of self-awareness and for kids and adults to learn about their sensory needs.
Hmm.
A lot of times when I start working with families, everybody's just getting triggered by each other and they don't
Yep.
really know why. And as we start to break it down and look at like, well, what accommodations might be helpful, it does start to ease. Like most of the parents I work with will wear some sort of ear protection,
Yep.
either all day or specifically as the day goes on and stress accumulates. I know for me, my
Yeah.
AirPods usually go in at 4 p.m. I can still be a parent, but it dulls all the auditory input and helps me a lot. And so my kids can still do the noisy things, but I'm not as bothered by it. Or if I am,
Hmm.
then we're navigating like could we perhaps be in different spaces, or what could this look like so that we're all still like meeting our needs yet respecting one another within the space that we are living in.
Yeah, boundaries are like super important too for especially for our family and a lot of the families I talk to is learning how boundaries are for us is really important and that we don't get to control other people, but we can still speak up for ourselves and find a way to compromise like that can at least help each other. It might not be perfect, but we can
Oh
find
yeah, it's
somewhere
always
in the
messy.
middle. Yeah.
Yeah. Boundaries,
Yeah.
I know I've had so much work to do there, and I work with almost every parent around that as well. Um, to be able to set respectful boundaries from a place of
Yeah.
regulation, right? Rather than
Yes.
getting to the point where you're completely dysregulated yourself, and then the boundary is coming out in yelling or upset, which then only further escalates everything. So it's like
Yeah.
learning how to set that boundary and have that awareness earlier on of like, okay, I'm
Yeah.
starting to feel like my body is like vibrating. I better do something about this now.
Oh my goodness. How many years did I spend vibrating before I realized that something needed to change?
Yeah.
Um, like that, I think that's part of, for me, that was definitely part of the journey of understanding how I was neurodivergent because I was fairly, like, I was sort of cursory, like, aware of um, late diagnosis autistic women. I had heard like an NPR article like years before I had kids, but it was just kind of like a seed that got stuck in the back of my mind. And then when I had kids, and kids change so much of your environment that
And your body.
any of your systems, any of your coping mechanisms that worked beforehand are stressed to the point that you either have to find new ones or like you just have you shut down. And so I think that is for me definitely what led to me realizing that I was autistic. And then later I realized I was ADHD as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
how did that how did that journey go for you?
Well, I mean, I think over the years, I really had just shut down from my intense sensory experiences because I'd always been told, especially as a little girl, like you're just too sensitive.
Hmm.
And so it was something I obviously had a lot of shame wrapped around and just had to like, I just felt like I had to grit my teeth and get through it. But then I would, you know, have really big periods of overwhelm and meltdown and, but always did that in private. But then once I had kids, like, yeah, it was so intense, and the amount of touch and the crying and not space to just decompress and be able to exercise or have some quiet time, like it was so just remember it being so intense. And I remember when my firstborn was he had a really hard time as an infant, which meant we all had a really hard time. You know, he really struggled
Yeah.
with feeding and sleeping, and his sensory needs were so profound. And we naturally tried our
Yeah.
best, but like didn't have all the information. But
Yep.
ended up like he was slept on us most of the time. He needed to be upright. He needed to be moving. He was often best sleeping on a vibrating dryer, you know, in his
Hmm.
cuddle seat. And I remember when he was about 6 months, I was at the pediatrician and I was like, things are really intense. And I knew the pediatrician and I said, you know, I think developmentally there might be some differences here. And he he looked at my son who'd played quietly on the floor by himself and hadn't engaged once. And he said, "Oh, he's great. Look at him. He can play all by himself for 30 minutes." As we talked. And I thought, okay. And I
Is
guess,
that normal for a 6 month old or
right.
how?
So
I don't know.
I
I
I
don't
guess I
think
was
so.
almost like I shut down a little bit and thought, oh, like
Yeah.
everything's fine. I'm just making it up.
Yeah.
And I was so sleep deprived. Like I can't describe how sleep deprived my husband and I got. It was
I
extraordinary.
understand that feeling.
And so that, you know, I really did doubt myself. And so
Yeah.
eventually I went back to work, and then he got to about almost 2 years old, and things were really intensifying with his sensory needs and just his overall needs and trying to do anything. And so I started like reaching out to some of the community supports, and pretty quick, people started saying, I think this, they used the word like, they didn't use autistic. They said, I think he has autism.
Yeah.
And, um, and it was shocking because I was like, no, 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 we already ruled that out when he was a baby. And so it started like really quickly coming into the awareness. And I remember it was when I was reading Barry Presents Uniquely Human book. And I went, oh my gosh, it's not only him, it's me. And that, like,
That
the light
balm, that
bulb,
internal balm
the
of,
internal
yeah,
bulb went off, and it was like, oh my gosh, everything. Like, I just started having so much
like,
understanding and empathy for all these like really difficult, and I'd had some really traumatic like mental health experiences in my adult, even in my youth years. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is this makes sense now. Um,
yes,
and so that was when my healing journey began.
yeah.
And I knew I had to pursue a diagnosis, like an assessment and diagnosis for my own healing. And I don't think everybody has to do that, if
That
you
is such
like,
a personal choice. Like, that is
exactly.
so personal.
But for me, I'd been through some really, really, really difficult mental health experiences and received some diagnoses that weren't correct.
Yep.
And so I was able to go for the autism assessment, and he said, "Yeah, no, those other diagnoses are incorrect. Like, you're
Yeah.
autistic and you
Yep.
have, this sensory profile that can lead to dysregulation and all sorts of behaviors and things like
Yeah.
that." So yeah, that's how I landed in like, oh, I'm autistic. And that was about 7 years ago. And I was like, oh, it's only my husband who's ADHD. And then as I learned more about like different ways that ADHD can present,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in females, I was like, oh, yep, that makes
Well,
sense. And then PDA came on board with the kids, and then both my husband and I are like, yep, I think we're all kind of landing into that profile.
it's interesting. I know I've seen some theories that PDA is specifically the intersection of being autistic and being ADHD,
Yeah,
and how those are in direct conflict with each other.
that's
And
fascinating.
so it's like our internal struggle to
Yeah,
make sense of that.
yeah. And the stress response system is just, you know, constantly
Yep.
activated. Yeah.
Yeah. And just, I also really appreciate how, like, in past few years, PDA has gained um, a new acronym, like that it stands also for persistent drive for autonomy,
Yeah.
because that definitely, I will say, like, pathological demand avoidance feels accurate for me personally, but so does a persistent drive for autonomy, because
Mhm.
that's what it comes from. Like, I don't want to have so many demands because I want to be in control of my own body.
Yeah. Yeah, I know for me, like I resonate with both terms. And when I'm working with families, I just try to like use the term that resonates most with them, because I know some people really do find the pathological word really troublesome, and it's very like
Yeah.
medical based. And um, but in one sense, like for me, I do find it quite founded, like it really is at a
It's,
really intense level,
yeah.
and there's such a mismatch with the way we live culturally that it is at that like pathological level, when you're in the
Yeah.
wrong environments, yeah, or non-supportive environments.
I mean, it's in the same way that I connect with obsessive compulsive disorder
Mhm.
in certain parts of my life, because
Yeah.
it is a compulsion for certain, like, it has been a compulsion. Like, I've worked through a lot of those things at this point because I have given myself accommodations and
Yeah.
worked through a lot of the reasons I had those compulsions. But as a
You're not
kid,
as stressed.
yes, I'm
Yeah.
regulated more
Yes.
often. But before, it was definitely compulsive in this, and in that same way, like, it feels pathological because I don't have a lot of control over it unless I address the root, like, the root of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's a way when you're kind of looking at things through a more of a like a social model of disability,
Hmm.
rather than a medical model of disability, to be able to use a word like pathological and it have a different meaning than in the medical, like if you're using the medical lens versus the social model lens. So that's kind of how I see
Yeah.
it. You can use that term and have a lot of empathy and compassion and understanding, and see it as like, that's a really distressed person, right? And
Hmm.
they're probably needing more support and accommodation.
I think that that's also an important part, though, is how we approach explaining ourselves with each other versus explaining our experience with medical professionals and
Mhm.
explaining our children's experience with medical professionals, because a lot of the time I have to almost put myself back several years to explain my kids to medical professionals, because we don't have any paperwork diagnoses,
Okay.
because United States insurance is complicated and expensive, um and even with assigned female at birth people, like any women, girls, like any people who do not present in a
Yeah.
stereotypical manner do not get diagnosed very easily. And so we've been through the testing, and basically they told us that my oldest wasn't suffering enough, so
Mm.
they could not diagnose my oldest child until middle school, when usually things started to fall apart more,
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
which
hard time.
I personally remember, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I remember when I was in middle school, that is when things got really, really hard,
Yeah.
because that's when
It was the
hormones
day I
start coming
went to
up.
middle school. Like I left grade 5. I was still quite innocent and like still
Hmm.
able to play dolls and line up
Yeah.
marbles, happy, but then went to middle school and it was like
Yeah.
my mom, she always tells me like we went shopping and got all your favorite colored clothing, and I went to school one day and I came home and I said I'm not wearing any of that, and I started, heavily masking, and
Yeah.
then the mental health stuff started kicking in. Yeah. And it was very,
Mhm.
very challenging because the social dynamics changed so much at that age,
Mhm.
especially for um like the groups of girls and like
Yes.
female presentation
It gets really clicky. It gets
it's really
really
clicky. Yeah.
socially vicious, like a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I look
And
back, I didn't
yeah,
understand it. Like
no.
I also did some things that caused, like,
Yeah.
had really negative consequences and then like years of bullying from it. But it's because I didn't understand those dynamics or how to navigate conflict or different, or like even how to manage my own dysregulation and sensory overwhelm that I was chronically experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know my go-to sensory response when I was overwhelmed as a child was anger and
Yeah.
fight.
Yeah.
It became freeze and fawn eventually,
Mhm.
but it was definitely fight from the beginning, and that doesn't lend well to making friends.
See, I went in public, I went more people pleasing, fawning,
Yeah.
and then at home I would become the big emotions would
Mm,
then come
yep.
out. The energy would come out at home. Yeah.
Yeah. That's definitely how my oldest ended up being. Like they would mask so heavily
Yeah.
at school, and they were the perfect student at school, which is
Yeah.
they were just the perfect student. And then they would come home, and it was incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It
I
was
can.
so hard. Um, so how did that end up? So you went through the process of realizing that you were neurodivergent
Mhm.
as your kids were young. How did that end up affecting you professionally and your family?
Well, yeah, I mean, it really did sort of lay the groundwork for this path I'm on. Uh, I'm a registered nurse, and I'd always found traditional nursing settings difficult. There's a real social, cliquey kind
Mm,
of component.
yes.
And so I always like, I ended up finding myself in very autonomous roles where I'd be like the public health nurse or the community health nurse working on reserve. Or like I worked in maternity, but like you're one-to-one with the client in when
Yeah.
they're in labor and delivery most of the time. And I just knew like I felt so constrained by the healthcare system and all of the policies and all of the things that didn't make sense and all the middle management. It must have been my PDA side, like really getting like it was so hard, right? Because you're expected to like be in this mold. And I just
Yep.
really, really struggled with that. And I would be okay on shift, but then after it'd be like, it was hard and there'd be like so much ruminating um, but it also worked a lot with families and families with like various disabilities. And when my son was diagnosed, I knew, okay, we're going to have a really different path here, and he's going to need a lot more from me. Um, and I've got to figure out a way to have more flexible work so that I can meet his needs.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I was uncovering my own neurodivergence and understanding why these traditional environments were so challenging for me. And so it was like, okay, I'm gonna take the leap. And that's when I just decided like I'm gonna start training in first like relationship based models, and then moving into like real like neurodiversity affirming practices, and really figuring out like this eclectic approach of like how to actually help families and get out of crisis, and then be able to find more regulation within the family unit, live more authentically to their neurodivergent needs, make difficult education choices, advocate for their needs in like healthcare and education environments and in their families and things like that. And then moving forward of like, what do you do like once you have like more regulation on board? How do you actually guide an autistic child who has a unique developmental pathway, but they still need guidance just like every
Yeah.
human? But we have to do it so delicately, and we have to do it, without hierarchy. We have to partner with them. And so looking at like, well, how do you scaffold an autistic child's development in a way that they're going to feel nurtured and it's not going to activate their stress response? And so that's the work I do with families. And generally, as I'm working with families, the parents are kind of discovering their own neurodivergence as well, and then doing their
Yep.
own healing work. And so I'm really like there with them, providing lots of intensive emotional support and helping them work through a lot, right? Because there's so much we have to work through as internally, and healing, getting to know ourselves, reparenting ourselves so that we can show up in the ways that we want to with our kids. So,
Yeah. That
yeah.
reparenting is not for the weak.
Oh my
Not for the
goodness.
weak.
Oh, it is, what's that saying? Take you to your knees? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's it's a lot. It's worth it. But oh
It
my,
is. It's so worth it. And I mean, I on the one hand, like before we have kids, it would be nice to know what we're getting into, but also I don't know that we would make the same choice if we did. But um but also if I hadn't had children, I don't know if I would have gone on this same journey, you know? Like I don't know that I would have realized.
yeah. Yeah, I know. I often think about that, and I don't know, because there's so much of the neurodiversity movement, and there's a lot more awareness now. So I do wonder,
Hmm.
like, would it have floated into my world?
It
Maybe,
might have
maybe not,
eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not in this profound way. Like, I think when you're walking this path with kids and then you choose to parent them and raise them differently outside of the
Hmm.
conventional
Yep.
norms, um, it changes you. And yeah, like it's been so profound. Like I'm a very different person now than, 10 years ago and before I had kids.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, you mentioned discover autism.
Mhm.
Um, that is your work, right?
Yeah, so that's my coaching and consulting business.
Okay.
And yeah, I started in British Columbia working with families, and now I work with families even further away, so like across Canada and sometimes in other countries. And yeah, so I mainly do like one-to-one work with families, and then I run courses. And now I'm starting to move more into professional development and starting to help create, like, help people create environments that are more inclusive, like truly inclusive to
Yeah.
neurodivergent needs. And so I'm really excited about that part. Like I'm launching in there, and I'm really excited where it's gonna go.
Yeah, it's so interesting when we are able, like when we make room for ourselves to grow in those ways because we are doing things that work for us, like working for ourselves often
Yeah,
and working a lot of times from home because it is a supportive environment and we need a supportive environment and finding a way to make our a lot of what I work with parents is environmental
yeah,
changes because so
yeah,
often we're working against that
yeah,
so much that I'm like, but why? Like, why is this important? Is it because that's the way you were raised? Is that like the way that your house was set up with your parents? Does
yeah.
that actually serve you? Like, we're actually able to control our environment and then we can start flourishing in a lot of other ways because we feel supported and we don't feel constantly dysregulated. And then we find out that, oh, we actually have way more interests than we thought we did because now we have a little bit more energy.
Yeah. The environment is huge. And then once it's set up more to meet your needs, it meets your needs, right? And
Yeah.
it's like you don't even have to put any, like there's some ongoing work, but like it's
Yeah.
there, it's supporting you, right? Like thinking of working from home, before COVID, I was on the road about 50% of the time, and I'd go see
Mm.
families, which I love, but
Yeah.
it had a huge toll on me. Being in other people's environments, driving, the transition time, it was huge. And I didn't realize the toll it was taking on me until I started working basically 100% from home during COVID.
Hmm.
And I had so much more energy. It was
Yeah.
fabulous. And I've basically continued. Once in a while, I'll go out and see a family because it is
Yeah.
really amazing to go into their environment and be like,
Yeah.
wow, okay, this is giving me so much information I didn't get on video. But
It
I
absolutely
do it like
does.
regularly. It's just, kind of like, hey, maybe I can come over and play for a little bit and just kind of, we can just look around, hang out.
Hmm.
But yeah, like working from home it's been amazing. I also have kids at home, like while I'm homeschooling them. So like at home,
Yes.
so it's like sometimes there's knocks on the door. Tonight somebody comes flying through the door, and I kind of love it. Like the families I work with also love it. Like they love seeing
Yeah.
the humanness of it all, right?
It feels more, it makes it easier to be people, to be
Yeah.
people with messy lives, to when
Yeah.
we see a not Pinterest version, a not Instagram version of people's lives, which it's so easy to get caught up in that just in parenting at all. Like we
Oh,
see the best. We
yeah.
see the best reels, the like the highlights,
Yeah.
and it's so hard to remember sometimes if we don't see reality.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That is
Yeah. I
such a
remember
small
one time,
portion.
what's that?
That was such like that's such a small portion of people's days.
Yeah. I remember one time my daughter came into my office while I was on a call with a mom, and she was like experiencing a lot of anxiety, and my daughter came in, and um I held some sort of a limit with her, but like with warmth and compassion, and I
Yeah,
didn't yell at her or anything. And she said to me, "Oh, now I get what it can look like." And
that's also
inside I was like, "Oh
amazing.
my gosh, like my kid is like on video." It was earlier in my practice, like now I don't
Mhm.
care, but like it ended up proving to me like, no, this is actually a good thing. Like I literally showed her like how you can lovingly hold a limit, but it
Yeah.
was in this messiness of like she came flying through my door while I'm in the
Yeah.
kitchen. And it was such a good moment for me as a professional, and has given me so much, like, I don't know, like compassion or like regulation around like, this is my life and you're going to see it sometimes, and that's okay. Like, I'm actually happy for you to be a part of it and see that I'm a
Yeah.
human. Like, I'm not an expert. I have a lot of knowledge and experience, but
Yeah.
like I'm living it too, and it's super messy over here too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I mean, that's really important for a lot of autistic and ADHD people is because just like our kids don't respond well or really acknowledge hierarchy,
Yeah.
we also I want to connect as a person
Yeah.
because that's the only way I feel connected.
Yeah.
And, most of the people I'm going to work with are also going to be neurodivergent because we communicate more easily. And so
Yeah.
we are just drawn to each other. And also, because that's specifically who my clientele is. But I think we just naturally draw to each other. And then it makes sense when we see how things work with other families.
Yeah.
It's also why I love group work, like small workshop group work, because then we get to share those experiences and say, well, what is normal in your household and how did you solve this problem?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's often like really, out of the box neurodivergent
Hmm.
ways of going about things that are like
Yep.
very different than what you might see in a more traditional house. Yeah. Like,
Yeah,
I
I
even
think
look at our
about,
spaces. We have so much sensory equipment everywhere. Like, you're
mhm.
in our family room, but there's a trampoline. You're in our bedroom and there's hammock swings, and
Yep,
it's like there's opportunities for regulation through everywhere
everywhere.
in the
Yep,
house. Like, I remember at one point we had this rope hanging down our stairwell, and like that was how the kids went from the main, like the basement
yep.
floor to the upper floor. And people would come into our house and like couldn't believe that we had kids swinging from a rope.
It's really hard to explain to people sometimes where you're like, this is what works for us. And yes, if you're coming into a neurodivergent house that is very affirming, like with a very traditional mindset of raising children where children should be controlled, children should follow directions. I'm like, that's not gonna work here.
You might not be very comfortable here.
And that's okay. That's
Yep.
that's a huge part of it too, is like self-selecting the people that just get us easily instead of
Yep.
trying to fit in with all of the people who rejected us forever.
And I've found that like over the years, it's like the village kind of has changed a lot, and it got smaller, but then it
Yep.
grows, right? As you
Yes.
connect with other neurodivergent. Um, for us, it's been like mainly connecting with other neurodivergent families, and all of
Hmm.
us have very unique environments that we live in, and
Yeah.
we're all working on shifting our parenting and approaches to everything. And yeah, really honoring that support and accommodation that's needed for everybody in the house, and that fluctuating capacity and all of those things. Yeah.
How do you one of the topics that often comes up for me with parents is how do you deal with people who are judgmental, who are either neurotypical or very indoctrinated with the idea of how parenting should work or how your routine or your life should work and are very vocal about that with you?
The truth is I don't have a ton of people like in my life right now who would fit that category. But
Yeah.
really, like, and I think it's the work I've done in really a lot of like the nervous system based work, and understanding that quite often, like, if you have a person who's very rigid and about what things need to look like, it's like they have their own complex history
Yes.
usually, and their own trauma that they might not be aware of, and they're actually usually in some sort of a stress
Yeah.
state. And so for me, it's like really about, if I'm in a regulated place, of course, it's about like compassion and curiosity about like, I wonder what's happening for this person
Yeah.
and why this is so important and why they're hanging on to it
Yes.
so much. And if
Yes.
I have longer relationship with someone like that, it's kind of like starting to ask maybe some coaching questions about like
Yes.
how that has served them or how it was when they were younger and being treated in a certain way. Like, what was that like?
How did that
And
feel?
how did it feel? And so some little
Yeah.
light bulbs start going off around, well, it actually felt terrible,
Yeah.
or, I just had to shut down because nobody was
Yep.
listening to what I needed. So it's like this slow progression, I
Like
find.
breadcrumbs.
Little breadcrumbs, yeah. But yeah, I've really come to this place of understanding that like there's reasons all behavior makes sense, right? That's what one of my colleagues says, Robin Gobble, is like all behavior makes sense. And so it's like looking at like if that person's behavior is confusing, trying to understand from like a human level, like what's happening for them. And they're
Yeah.
probably like not feeling safe or connected,
Yeah.
and they're probably not very regulated. So that's kind of where my thinking goes. And then depending on the situation, it can look different. Sometimes I do choose to just be like respectful and disengage because I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't have the spoons for that, and it's not going to make
Yeah.
a difference. But so it really depends on who it is and what relationship it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's definitely important is how much we have to assess for ourselves is like how much does this relationship matter to me, to my family, to us as a whole? How much do I need to invest in it? And sometimes we do need to invest for safety or for financial or pragmatic reasons.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we just kind of have to go along and get along and not poke the bear too much if
Yeah.
they are very contentious. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I find too, like in my work, for example, if I'm doing a discovery call, I'm very transparent about how I work. And so I sort of am feeling out like, would we be a good fit? Because I don't want to, like, if someone's
Yeah.
not ready to take this path, like, I don't want to force it upon them.
Mhm.
I can give them a little bit of information. I can maybe share a resource that might be helpful for them, but
Mhm.
also like, what, maybe go out and do a little bit of reading and come back like if
Yeah.
you want to explore this again. But like that's also something I do in my work is, and I used to um more in the beginning, it was like when you're starting a business, you don't necessarily, you kind of have to work with anybody, right? And so I remember
Yeah.
working with some families where it was hard, right? Because they weren't ready in some ways. And
Yeah.
so I
They
think
knew
everybody
they
has,
needed help, but they weren't quite ready for your help.
exactly, like they still just wanted to know which
Yeah.
consequence to use that was going to
Yeah.
work, and that we know that's not going to help with
That's not what works. And it's
regulation and connection. Yeah.
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 And that's I think that's just a truth about a lot of relationships is that sometimes I think so much of working on my own nervous system and my kids' nervous systems is regulating us so that we are okay being not in a circle, right? Like not putting ourselves into situations or relationships that don't feel supportive
Yeah.
and putting our self-worth on the line because we are desperate for connection.
Hmm.
Like being so in touch with ourselves that we know what is for us and what is not for us.
Yeah.
And that's like a constant journey.
It's constant. Yeah. Yeah. I know I'm
Because
thinking like it's
yeah,
sometimes like it can be isolating at times because you
yes.
do want, as a human, you
Yeah.
need connection, right? But yeah, it's like putting yourself into environments that don't match and where you don't have felt safety. um, that's going to have some pretty big fallout, right? And it just doesn't nourish you as a person and as a human. Yeah.
Mhm. And sometimes, unfortunately, we have to put ourselves in those situations so that we can find the people that are safe.
Yeah.
Like I've done plenty of, mom groups and other things through the years where I'm like, I know that the probability of me finding a person that matches with me is very low, but I'm gonna try it and then I'm gonna wait for a long while and then I'm gonna try a different thing.
Yeah.
Like just I think, I mean, it's like with so many things, like the way that I get through stuff is I keep going. I
Yeah.
take breaks, but I don't
Yeah.
quit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'd say I'm very similar now. Like I do always look at like, well, what's out there? What could we try? But I don't get hung up on like we have to commit to it or it has to
Yeah.
be something. It's just like we're just gonna give it a go.
Hmm.
And maybe I'll meet someone, maybe you'll meet someone, or maybe we won't. And maybe we'll stay for 5 minutes, or maybe we'll stay for an hour, depending on
Yeah.
the environment and the relationships are like, right? And just
Yep.
being okay with that.
Yep.
That's been a huge journey for all of us in my family too, of being able to just test things out and knowing,
Yes.
especially as neurodivergent, like a lot of those relationships or environments aren't going to be a match.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying, right? But as you
Yeah.
say, like take the break, rest,
And then
recharge.
we kind of, I think it's important to sort of debrief afterward
Yeah.
too, especially with my kids to be like, well, what did you enjoy? Did you
Yeah.
enjoy anything? Or what was really hard?
Yeah.
And learning more about ourselves so that we can assess better next time. Is this an environment that I'm going to likely enjoy or not?
Mhm. I find that reflection piece with kids is so important, and the wisdom that they gain about themselves is
Hmm.
amazing, and then that facilitates that self-advocacy piece as they go forward on that journey, and that confidence of saying no when they just
Yes.
know, "I'm too tired," or "That wasn't a good fit." They know that their no will be listened to, and,
Yes.
like, I love seeing that in kids.
I have so my oldest was in public school until about fourth grade when we finally just removed all of them because it was not working and it was really bad.
Yeah.
But as so many of us experience, and I think that a lot of us go through those moments where we try to put them back in and then we try to take them out and we try a different school and then we take them out again and well maybe this other thing will work.
Yeah.
And it really is. I would get so frustrated years ago like that I'm like I feel like a terrible parent. I feel like I'm just not doing this right. Like I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, but nothing is
Yeah.
working because I didn't understand that that's the process. Like that even though I would love for things to just work, like that's not our process. Our
That's not
process
our path.
is trying things. It is like let me like step my toe out here and see what's working and then I'll pull back and I'll like maybe I'll try again a little bit later.
And like following of interests, which
Hmm.
and so the path continues to shift too. And that's kind of making acceptance with that. I know I've had a lot of growth I've had to do there because like, I was in public school as a kid. And so I went to my
Yep.
elementary, my middle, and my high school, and the path was clear. Um, And this path with my kids is not at all like that. It's like we're here for a bit and then we're here for a bit and then we're here for a bit and being like, that's okay. And that actually is the
Yeah.
neurodivergent path and
And
being
so
okay
much of
with
the
that.
Yeah, so much of the neurodivergent experience to me is trusting that given enough time, we're going to figure it out. But
Yeah.
we have to give ourselves way more time and way more room to feel into our feelings and like think about how we feel about things and what our interests are and what they've shifted to and all sorts of things. We have to give ourselves room and time that neurotypicals are often impatient for. Like
Oh,
they just
absolutely.
want
Yeah.
us to like rush along and get with the program and
Yeah.
do what would be easier for them.
Yeah. They're like, you've had a day, you've had a week, you've had 3 months, let's get going, you know?
And at which point we're just like stressing out and like hyperventilating, like, but I don't know.
Another couple years, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So much is just like becoming okay with the fact that it's gonna take us a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really, I always think of it as like throwing out all those typical pathways or standards and
Hmm.
really just honoring this is a very unique journey. And it's very unique for each child too. I find
Yes.
like there's similarities, but there's also differences in
Hmm.
how neurodivergent children are navigating their path and how their families
Yeah.
are doing it.
Because again, every kid is an individual,
Yep.
like just like every person.
Yep.
My middle child is my biggest lesson in life. Like
Me too,
he,
actually.
yeah, middle kids. I think it's part of that. I think
I think
it's
so. Yep.
yeah, where I have to slow down and I have to like listen and ask him questions and wonder like, okay, well, what is going to work for you? Because obviously, like my ideas, those are unimportant.
Hmm.
What is going to work for you?
Hmm. Do you follow a self-directed education type of approach with them?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we are unschoolers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we are
Yeah.
unschoolers because my oldest likes a little more structure because
Okay.
they have a little bit of anxiety and they want to be able to have very low demand but specific goals.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense.
Um, so theirs are usually just like you've read X amount of pages each day or X amount of chapters or whatever it is that you're reading on this, and you've done this exercise or like however many exercises in this subject. And we definitely lean towards gamey apps
Hmm.
for math and some science stuff,
Okay, yeah.
but that definitely helps. And then my middle kid is completely unschool. It's
Yeah.
just completely interest based for him
Yep.
because any kind of direction he is going to buck against.
Yeah.
It has to be
That's
his
our
idea.
experience. Yeah. Everything has to be
Yes.
interest led.
Yes.
Uh, yeah. And I know for myself, probably like my autistic side is like, I would love to be able to just,
Structure.
here's the curriculum and we check these boxes, like even if it's in a very, very unconventional way. There's still
Yeah.
a part of me that would love that. But then seeing the kids, how they learn is so fascinating
Yeah.
to me.
It's picking up little things and then like they're going to set that aside for a minute and they're going to pick up another thing and then eventually down the road they connect them.
link, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's so much more meaningful than just learning it
Yeah.
from a piece of paper, right? Like it's
Yeah.
actually going to stick because it has the emotion and the
Hmm.
interest tied to it.
Yeah. And also because my middle kid, he does get things really quickly.
Hmm.
It's just that his attention is also gone very quickly.
Hmm.
So he was the main impetus for us taking them out of public school because was non-compliant. Not he was not built for public school. Trying the teachers could not come up with enough interesting things for him to do to
Yeah.
keep him occupied so that he was not trying to occupy himself by talking and doing things and like going to pack his bag and he's like, I'm ready to go home now. Okay.
Yeah.
Like
You're like,
it's
you have
not
another four
lunchtime.
hours actually.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
actually even lunch because he was done. He was like, I already know all of this. Why do I need to be here?
And school, like
Yeah.
it can be quite repetitive, right? It's because you look at like, you hear those stories of unschooler, self-directed educated kids who, you know, decide like, okay, I do want to get my high school diploma. And then they
Yeah.
study for 6 months, you know,
Yeah.
they cram and learn it all, right? So it's
Yep.
like, it's possible to like
Yeah.
cover all of that content in a shorter amount of time. And so if you're noticing how repetitive it is and that you already know
Yeah.
these things, like of course it'll just drive your neurodivergent wiring crazy.
It's physically painful. Like that
Oh yeah.
boredom for ADHD and autistic people can be physically
And like
painful.
rage inducing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he would just shut down. I mean, he was just done. He was like, "You're not listening to me. I don't have anything else to say to you." And then like the behaviors to make it more apparent would become like worse. And that was really hard.
Was it like he was shutting down at school and then at home really struggling? Is that sort of the
I mean,
how it
he was
was?
going selectively mute
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
at school, and they were treating it as though he was choosing.
Of course, yes. Yeah, he's doing that on purpose.
Yeah, that
Oh
and
my
they would
goodness.
just sit
Yeah.
him in the principal's office and say like, "Well, he just won't talk to us." And I'm like, "He can't talk to you. He doesn't, he lost the ability. Like he
In
doesn't
He's
have it.
distressed. Yeah.
He's obviously in severe distress.
Yeah.
Like, how do I make you understand that?" And I was up at the school so frequently that I was like, what is the point? Like, what is the point in me doing this? Because they're not listening, they're not doing the things that legally they should be doing.
Hmm.
And it really just depends. I know plenty of people who've had good experiences with public school and get the supports that they need, but it is so dependent upon the district and the people specifically there.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's just
And you don't
random.
know who you're going to
Nope.
get. Yeah.
Even if you go to buy a house or get a place in a district that other people say is, you know, supportive or has a good special needs program, it still depends. It's like maybe that's a good special needs program for some of the kids, but they are all such individuals that it isn't going to fit all of them. Or they're at capacity and like they literally just lack the staff and the resources.
Yeah. 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 We put my son, because I knew when he was after his preschool experiences, I knew he can't go into
Yeah.
brick and mortar. Like this is like he 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 can't. Like it was so clear. And so we have an outdoor program in like through the district. And I thought, oh, this is it. And I'd heard such good things about kids with different needs in the program. And I thought, oh, excellent.
Hmm.
And he didn't get in for kindergarten, but he got in for grade one. And I was like over the moon excited.
Yeah.
And yeah, it ended up being it was still like they were out in the forest, but it was still they
Yeah.
had the core curriculum and the demands, and the teachers were approaching things in more traditional ways.
Yeah.
And it was it was so difficult for him.
Yeah.
Um, and we tried for about 2.5 years. I don't really
Yeah.
think he attended that much, and all the days were short, and he was getting picked up early, and getting him there was
Yep.
so hard. And he was just so at over capacity most of the
Yeah.
time. And then he stopped
Where
sleeping.
every day you come home and it's
Oh,
explosive and
yeah, yeah.
like I was really concerned with my I at looking back, I wish I had taken them out sooner because my oldest was not safe for themselves.
Yeah.
It was really painful, and I wish that I had had the support to know that it really was going to be okay if I took them out. It
I
really,
think there's so much fear of, well, what
yeah,
is that other path? Right.
yeah,
And I don't think I can do it. Most parents I talk to are so afraid that they can't do it because they think that they have to recreate school at home. That's the biggest thing is like, well, I'm not
yes,
a teacher and I don't know these things and I can't, my kid won't listen to me. And it's like, okay, like it's this whole reimagining what education is.
yeah. And also that the thing that I kept coming back to, which thankfully we had a really supportive children's therapist that we were helping that was helping us at the time. towards the end of their stint in public school.
Hmm.
Um, and he was really supportive of us pulling them out finally because he was like, I think we gave it a good shot. I
Hmm.
think we gave it a good try, and maybe you can try again. But right now, what you know is that dysregulated kids don't learn. Like kids who are constantly activated, like their nervous systems are overwhelmed, those kids can't learn.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're getting any benefit out of it
Yeah. They're
compared
just becoming
to,
more chronically dysregulated, which is then encoding more of the survival patterns in their nervous
yeah,
system, right? Yeah.
yeah. And that's a lot of the reason my oldest is still such a low demand kid because I can see a lot of myself in them. And I definitely thrived on that. I am more autistic, I guess, like than ADHD
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. I love structure, I love routine, and
Yeah.
they do too, but they were so traumatized by the demands of public school that we are still unwrapping that. Like we are
Oh, yeah.
still pulling it back. And I think that eventually they might thrive with some more routine and like be able to do more, but we are taking it at a much slower pace.
Yeah. Well, and it's that like really like it is that deschooling process and that recovery to get back to like that your neurodivergent baseline,
Yeah,
right? And it takes years. I
it
know with my
does.
son, it took, I mean, how many years are we now out? I think 3.
Yeah,
And I think we're
we're
really
almost at
close
three.
now. Yeah,
We're
and he
almost at three fully because like we did some back and forth for a while, but
okay,
until
yeah.
you are fully out, I think it's just that constant like re-traumatization.
Oh, absolutely. And there's that pressure of like, so what do you think? Like next week, next month? Oh, the teacher
Yeah,
was asking how you're doing, you know? And
yeah,
so it's like there is this hidden pressure and
yes.
you're feeling it, they're feeling it. And so nobody's nervous system can actually relax because you're like, you know, like the school's kind of expecting it
Hmm.
at some point. And
Hmm.
yeah, it just creates this cycle. And then it impacts your relationship with your kid too.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's the very real legal side, at least in the US. I don't know the laws up there, but um, I was sort of always terrified of missing too many days because eventually the truancy officer comes by and says you have to come into court and explain why your child is not coming into school. And so you have to make sure that you have documentation from the doctors, from all sorts of places. And eventually it becomes so untenable that, again, it was just simpler to take them out.
Yeah. 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 Oh, that's so stressful as a parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where you're like weighing constantly, how much can I let them stay home because I know that they need
They
to?
need it. Yeah.
And how much do I push them to go to school when they don't want to so that they have the days when they need to stay home? And that's such a terrible choice to have to make.
Yeah, it's not so strict here. Um, the schools will do a lot of like threatening of,
Yeah.
your child does need to be coming more. I know like we had to get a doctor's note, and so there needs to be like medical evidence.
Yeah.
But I've never actually trying to think if I know of any cases where there was any legal action, and I don't think I know of any. But generally what the schools will do is they'll basically pressure you to like then take your kid out of the
Yeah.
school. Um,
Yeah.
so there's
Because
that's
they don't
kind of
want
where they start.
you,
Yeah.
they don't want your kid on the rolls because then it affects their, I don't know. I know here it affects their funding. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it affects the funding here, especially because like these kids come in with extra funding.
yeah.
And so a lot of kids do end up getting like excluded from school. And there's like a huge movement here of people speaking up about that because so many neurodivergent kids have been excluded
Yeah.
and are now home learning. And
Mhm.
you know, it's what they need a lot of the time, but like it's very difficult for many parents who didn't choose that
Yeah,
path and then have to make very big decisions around work and housing and things like that to be able to support the kind of like unexpected
yeah,
path that they're on. Yeah.
definitely. Because even if you have a stay-at-home parent for the first couple of years, you kind of expect
Yeah.
that eventually, like once they're in school, you'll be able to go back to some kind of work.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us, that is not the case. Um,
Or you have to be really creative as to
yes.
how it looks. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, like working from home, having our
Yeah.
own business is very supportive of that. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's why a lot of us end up in these fields.
I think so. Yeah.
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 Okay. This has been like just an amazing conversation. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
No, I really enjoyed our
Yeah.
conversation. We meandered around and yeah, it's
Yeah.
been really, really
As
great to connect.
neurodivergent conversations tend to
Right?
do.
Exactly. Yes. Wonderful. Well,
So,
thank you for having me.
yeah, this was wonderful. Did you want to mention your business or if you have any places that people can find you on the
Sure.
internet?
Yeah. So if people want to connect with me, they can go to discoverautism.ca.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you are, um, I know on social media somewhere, but it's okay if
Yeah.
you,
So I am on, what am I on? Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I have.
okay.
Uh,
We'll put
I
those
very
in the show notes.
neurodivergently post on there. It goes in like I'll post for a while and then I won't post for a while and then I'll post a little
Yeah.
bit and then I won't post. So yeah. But
Yep.
please, yeah, feel free to connect with me there. And I do
Awesome.
write some blog posts and I love creating infographics and social media posts. So when they come out, they're
I love
usually
that.
like fun and engaging. Yeah.
That is not my forte, so I always love like looking at other people's
Yeah,
infographics.
yeah. Well, it's so funny because it's become like I didn't do any sort of like graphic design ever. And then through my
Yeah,
business, I've started using Canva a lot. And now I'm actually like really loving it. And I've become quite good at it. And I've started even making infographics and stuff for some of my colleagues and whatnot. So it's another kind of like special interest of mine right
I
now
love that.
is the yeah, graphic design infographic stuff. Yeah.
I love the way our brains work.
I know. And I always love ideas. So if anybody wants an
Yeah.
infographic on something, just reach out to me and I'll make it.
I will keep that in mind.
Yeah. Good.
Awesome.
Thank
This was
you.
fantastic. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. And we will catch you guys next time. This has been the Neurodivergent Parenting Podcast. We are part of the Neurodivergent Media Network, and you can find me, Melissa Cox, on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. You can always find my information on Facebook and send me a message if you'd like to work with me. I'm pretty open and public about all of my offerings on there. We will catch you next time.